Hey everybody, thanks for tuning back into OTRAM's YouTube channel. Today we're doing CV axles on a 2013 Toyota Tacoma. Before we get started, I just wanted to say, hey, if you like these videos, please like and subscribe. It really helps the videos get out there and the channel grow. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out our membership page. It's got the videos that I haven't released yet pre-posted on there. And right now, at the time of filming, we're running about a month ahead on videos. So if you want more videos faster, check out the membership page. With that said, let me move the camera up underneath and we'll get started. Thanks. The first thing we need to do before we get started is to drain the front diff, and the drain plug is just here on the driver's side bottom. Before you pull this though, make sure that you can loosen up the fill plug, because you don't want to drain the diff if you can't get the fill plug open. And with these being hex bolts, they're real easy to strip and find out the hard way that you can't get it back open. So always pull the fill first. And these are coming loose easy because I already popped them loose so that I wouldn't be struggling on camera. Oh, and I'm gonna go wash everything off of me now that I'm covered in gear oil. And we'll be back. And then next up, while that front diff's draining, we can go ahead and take out the ABS sensor bolt. And this one might be fun because that's feeling like it's pretty crunchy. There we go. Oh, doesn't seem that bad. And then once the bolt's out, you just want to gently wiggle it out of its hole. Trying to wiggle this without getting in you guys' view. I'm gonna spray a little lube in there. There's a little tip of the sensor that goes in there, and there's an O-ring on it. And a lot of times that O-ring will get dried up and get stuck in there. Meanwhile, let me let that soak for a minute, and we'll go ahead and undo the rest of the wire clips. And there's one here on top of the knuckle. I'm just gonna take a pocket screwdriver and pop that latch. See if I can get it in there. There we go. And there's that one freed up. And then there's another one of those right here on the knuckle, which are all very awkwardly placed. There we go. You can also pull that whole clip out of the knuckle. The problem with doing that is a lot of times the little ears will break off and then you have nothing to stick back in. So when I can, I like to open the latches on them instead. And then there's a 10mm bolt right below the upper sway bar link. It's holding the rest of that cable on. And I'm gonna get an impact because that bracket's wanting to bend. There we go. There we go. With a little lube. That came the rest of the way off, and you can see there's a little O-ring, and you can see it's got some rust on it. And then the sensor tip. And we can take this wire and stick it back out of the way. because you don't want to stretch or pull that wire any, because there's real fine wires inside of it that are very easy to break. And then you don't have ABS signal. Now that that's out of the way, we can take the tie rod end off. Actually, I'm going to just take it loose for now because we're going to do some work over here. So we got to take the cotter pin out. I like to just use a pair of diagonal cutters to bend that back. And then just grab the end and pull it through. And then that's a 19 millimeter socket. Zip that off. So now that we've got the nut off of here, we need to release the taper that's holding the ball joint in. And there's a couple ways of doing this. You can either wail on this with a hammer, and the shock of hitting the steering arm will jar the taper loose and the tie rod end will fall out. Or a safer way would be use a tie rod puller. This one's OTC. I've got a whole kit of them. Or you can rent these from the parts store usually. But my preferred method is these CTA hammer nuts, just because they're quicker and easier. And relatively cheap. But they just thread on in place of the tie rod end bolt, and then you hit them with an air hammer. And it pops them out nice and easy. The nice thing about using either these hammer nuts or that tie rod puller is there's less chance of messing up the threads on here and the boot. If you were to use the old school pickle fork, there's a really good chance you're going to rip the boot, and since we're trying to reuse this, that's not something you want to do. So now we can come around to the outside, and I actually got a little ahead of myself taking the tie rod loose. That let this flop around, which was going to make this part more difficult, so I've got the tie rod nut loosely threaded back on. We can take this dust cap off, and you're going to want a sharp chisel to kind of work your way around and knock this loose. And take your time at this. It's real easy to mangle this cap to where it doesn't seal right anymore if you hit one spot too hard or too often. There we go. But this cap is thin sheet metal, and we see them all the time where this has been smashed in flat or somebody's driven a chisel clean through. So just take your time, be careful taking this off. And then once that's out of there, we can come in here and grab this cotter pin, uncurl it, come on. There we go, pop that out. Then we can take this little lock star off and set it aside. And then you're going to need a 35 millimeter deep socket to get this hub nut off. There we go. And you want to look at the threads on there to make sure that they're not chewed up before you put that nut onto the new CV, because I've ruined a new CV putting a bad nut back on and stripping threads off of the new one. So don't do that. So now that we've got the axle loose the hub end, we can go ahead and loosen the lower control arm. There's two 19mm bolts down here on the bottom. We're going to zip those out. And that, and forgot I put the tie rod nut back on. There we go. That'll give us the space to fish this end of the CV out. I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but that's why we're replacing it. There's a big hole in the boot, and it looks like it's getting ready to tear up there as well. Let me move the camera around and we'll undo the inside. Okay, so now we're ready to take the inner end of the CV out, and it is splined into the side of the differential. So you can come in here, in between the diff and the axle. And kind of pop that loose. There we go. And then we always do the inner seals while we've got the axles out. So we're gonna go ahead and pop that out. Or just mangle it. There we go. And with that out of the way, I'm gonna clean up this hole and we'll put the new seal in. So now that we've got this bore cleaned up, we can put our new seal in. And I've got this Wits End seal driver, which Wits End's now defunct, but Trail Tailor and Delta Vehicle Systems have started reproducing some of the lost stuff. So hopefully they'll come back out with this soon, because it makes it really nice because it holds the seal. And then it fits into that recess so that you drive it straight and to the proper depth, which makes it real easy. So there's our new seal in. I'm gonna grab some grease and grease up the inside of the lip just so we don't run dry when we put the axle in, and then I'll bring you back for actually putting the axle in. So now that we've got the seal all greased, it's time to put the shaft in. And you'll notice there's a snap ring here on the end of the axle shaft. And let me see if I can spin it around. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see that or not, but there's an open end. It's easiest if you set it so that open end is facing down. It makes it easier to get the clip in to engage. And then there we go. So I'm gonna spin that so that the clip's facing down before I put that in. And I'm gonna get that kind of seated. And then you'll see there's some grooves here in the axle. I'm gonna take a long chisel and use it to drive that in. Sometimes it takes a few shots to get it lined up, but then once it's in there, you want to wiggle it and pull out on it to make sure that that snap ring did catch and that you're sealed in. So we've got the inner end in, and we're going to put some high pressure grease on the splines on the outside here to help keep the wear down where the splines engage the hub splines. I like to use this ARP Ultra Torque assembly lube, mostly because it's easy to brush on and it seems to work well. But you could use just wheel bearing grease, moly grease, just something to lubricate those splines. And then the fun part of pulling all this out there we go. It can be fun to get the axle to seat and the ball joint mounts to line up and everything. So just take your time as you're fiddling it around. I'm gonna wash my hands and get degreased, and then I'll come back and we'll bolt everything back together. So now that we've got our axle pushed through, we can put our lower ball joint bolts back in, and I put some red Loctite on these because these are definitely not something that you want to come loose. And then the real fun part is getting these lined back up with their holes under here. And you want to start these by hand because it's real easy to get them cross-threaded. And if you mess up the threads, you end up needing a whole new spindle, like the whole upright, which is not exactly cheap. So once we got those started, we'll lightly zip those up. And then we're going to torque those to 118 foot-pounds. But before I do, I'm going to lightly put my tie rod end back in, just so my whole assembly doesn't spin while I'm trying to torque. So we'll torque these up to 118. And I like to do them twice, just to be extra sure that we've got them. And then I'll snug that guy up. And the tie rod end nut goes to 67 foot-pounds. There we go. And we got lucky. Let me move you up. You can't see me. We got lucky while tightening that up, and the hole for the cotter pin lines up, which is nice. And then we can take our ABS line and fish it back down through here. We're going to put the little bolt back in here in the back side. Snug that up. And then we've got our little clamp here that holds it. We're going to put that back in there. And latch it. And then same thing with this one that's on top of the knuckle. And snap it. And then we're going to make sure that our sensor's clean. Let me grab a paper towel. You want to make sure the sensor's clean because anything on the tip's magnetic, will mess up your ABS readings. Then you also want to look down here and make sure there's not a huge amount of rust built up where the sensor goes in. And then we'll just gently wiggle that back in and put its bolt in. And I'm actually going to pull that back out because looking at the side, it's not fully seating. I think I'm going to put a little silicone grease on that O-ring. If this doesn't seat fully flat in there, the air gap is wrong on the tip of the sensor, and your speed readings will be erratic. So I'll just put a little dielectric grease on here. You just don't want to get any on the tip. And we'll see if that goes in any better. There we go. We've had so many trucks, like, you've done an axle shaft or, front brake work or something where you've had this sensor out, and then you put everything back together and you go for a test drive and you've got an ABS light on, and it's because the sensor just didn't fully seat. So always try to watch that now and make sure, extra sure that I'm seated. And then we'll just take our new cotter pin and stick it in there. And bend our tabs. Okay, so we've got our lower ball joint bolts in. We've got our tie rod all torqued up. Let me move you around to the front here, or the side rather, and we'll put the hub nut back in. Okay, so we're down to the home stretch. We just need to put the axle nut on. So stick that on there. And then this is all going to want to spin as we tighten it. So I'm just going to put a punch in the vanes of the rotor to catch against the caliper here to hold that still. And then we're going to torque this to 173. And it's going to spin for a while as we seat the axle into it. I probably should have buzzed this down with the impact first. There we go. And we'll give that a couple of good torques to make sure we're right. And it's very important that you torque this nut because this is what holds the two halves of the wheel bearing together and sets the preload. If this is too tight or too loose, you'll ruin your wheel bearing. Don't forget to take your punch out. And then we'll take the lock tab and actually let me spin it so that my hole's on top so it's easier to see. And as you move it around, you'll find a spot where the notches in this line up to the hole. And then we can just take a pair of needle nose pliers and bend that cotter pin around. And then we can put our center cap back on. And when you're starting the center cap, you want to make sure all of the edges are in, because if it's bent a little bit, it's easy to have a bit of the sheet metal flared out. And when you start tapping it in, instead of it going into the hub, it'll bend and flare so that the flange is all messed up. There we go. And then I got greasy fingerprints on here when I was moving everything around. So we're going to take some brake clean. And wipe down the rotor face. And I'm going to spin it because I'm sure I spun it and got junk on there too. Give it a good last spray down. So yeah, now everything's back together, axle's in. The only thing left is to fill the front differential back up. So I'll do that off camera because it's really boring and you don't really need to see that. When you're doing that, just make sure that you replace the drain plug crush washer and the fill plug crush washer. But yeah, that's changing the axle on a 2013 Toyota Tacoma. Hope you found that useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out our membership page. I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.